In a stunning twist of justice, the tables are turned as a courageous good cop takes a stand against corruption within the ranks. In this gripping story, we will know how a determined officer's unwavering commitment to truth and justice leads to the downfall of a rogue colleague, resulting in his arrest and dismissal. We will learn about this incident through the use of a body cam. On July 26, 2021, Officer David Lance Dukes from the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety went to a townhouse in response to a call about a man banging on the door. It was reported that the man had a gun tucked in his waistband. When Officer Dukes arrived, he immediately pulled out his own gun and told Clarence Gaillard, a 58-year-old disabled man, and his cousin Demario Julian, who were both standing in the parking lot outside the townhouse, to get down on the ground. Mr. Gaillard tries to follow Officer Duke's instructions by going down on his hands and knees. However, Officer Duke forcefully uses his foot to try to make Mr. Gaillard fall completely to the ground, causing his head to hit the pavement violently. In a court case called Graham v. Connor in 1989, the Supreme Court explained that the Fourth Amendment says police officers should only use force that is reasonable given the situation. The court also listed 3 factors that should be considered when deciding if the use of force was reasonable. These factors are how serious the crime is, whether the suspect is an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, and whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or trying to run away from arrest. More recently, in a court case in 2016 between Ronald Armstrong and the village of Pinehurst, a court in the Fourth Circuit, which includes South Carolina, stated that if someone doesn't follow legal orders, some force can be used, but the amount of force depends on the risks involved in the resistance. Even if someone resists passively, it can still justify the use of some force, but the level of force allowed depends on the specific situation. In this particular case, the severity of the crime was not very serious, even though Officer Dukes thought Mr. Gaillard might have a gun when they first encountered each other. However, when Officer Dukes used force against Mr. Gaillard, it was clear that he was not an immediate threat because he had raised his empty hands above his head and then he got down on his hands and knees. Additionally, Mr. Gaillard was not actively resisting arrest. In fact, he was trying to do what Officer Dukes told him to do when the force was used. Considering these circumstances, it is highly likely that a court would say that Officer Dukes' use of force against Mr. Gaillard was not justified or reasonable. Officer Dukes says that when Mr. Gaillard was walking from behind the white vehicle, he thought he had a gun and repeatedly told him to put it down. Officer Dukes also says that when Mr. Gaillard stood in front of the vehicle, he had his hands in his pockets and ignored requests to show his hands. However, the body camera footage shows that Mr. Gaillard actually had his hands raised above his head. When Officer Dukes yelled at Mr. Gaillard to lie on the ground several times, he never asked him to drop a gun or show his hands, probably because Mr. Gaillard's hands were visible the whole time. A report filed by Corporal Brandy Smith, who was also at the scene, says that when Mr. Gaillard was walking from the passenger side of the vehicle, it seemed like he had his hands in his pockets. But when he reached for the front of the vehicle, he took his hands out of his pockets. Corporal Smith's report also mentions that Officer Dukes loudly commanded Mr. Gaillard to lie on the ground, but it does not mention a gun or any commands to drop a gun or show his hands. It's important to know that when Officer Dukes talked about what happened, he didn't explain how he brought Mr. Gaillard down. Corporal Smith's report said that when Mr. Gaillard didn't fully lie down on the ground, Officer Dukes pushed him down by putting his right foot on Mr. Gaillard's back. However, Sergeant Aqueli Polidor's report states that Officer Dukes jumped up and stomped Mr. Gaillard on the back of his neck with his foot. It's not clear from the body camera video whether Officer Dukes' foot landed on Mr. Gaillard's neck or upper back, but it's certain that Officer Dukes' explanation to his superior didn't match the body camera footage or the reports from his colleagues. Mr. Julian asked Officer Dukes for a business card, but Officer Dukes said they don't get cards from their department. But Sergeant Polidor quickly corrected Officer Dukes and said they do have cards. Sergeant Polidor gave Mr. Julian the information he wanted. If it's proven that Officer Dukes intentionally lied to Mr. Julian to avoid responsibility for what he did, he could be found guilty of 2 common crimes in South Carolina: obstructing justice and official misconduct. In 1997, there was a court case in South Carolina called State v. Lyles Gray. The Court of Appeals decided that an officer from the Camden Police Department was guilty of 2 crimes: obstruction of justice and misconduct in office. The court explained that obstruction of justice means doing something that stops or makes it difficult for the legal system to work properly. Misconduct in office is when someone in a public position doesn't do their job according to the law. In this case, the court found that the officer obstructed justice and committed misconduct in office by not interviewing witnesses after her daughter was suspected of a crime, getting a false arrest warrant for someone else, and hiding evidence. Another officer, Officer Dukes, lied about whether the department gives out identification cards, but it wasn't as serious as the other crimes. However, because both obstruction of justice and misconduct in office have broad definitions, Officer Dukes could still be convicted if charged. It's important to know that in South Carolina, police officers are not legally required to show their identification when asked by citizens. Some police departments have policies that make it mandatory for officers to identify themselves, but we don't have access to the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety's policy, so we don't know if it follows any identification rules. Mr. Gaillard and Mr. Julian were allowed to leave 2 days after the incident, following treatment by EMS. Officer Dukes was fired from the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety because he broke the department's rules about using force. These rules are not available to the public. On August 25, 2021, former Officer Dukes was charged with first-degree assault and battery, which could lead to a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Currently, Mr. Gaillard has a lawyer representing him, but he has not yet taken any legal action against Officer Dukes or the entire department. Former Orangeburg Officer Dukes did very bad things. He physically hurt Mr. Gaillard without a reason. He lied about what happened in his police report. He tried hard to avoid getting in trouble for his silly actions. Mr. Dukes didn't face any danger during the incident, so it's clear that he hurt Mr. Gaillard because he wanted to feel important, not to keep people safe. There was no good reason for him to push Mr. Gaillard's face into the ground, when it was obvious that Mr. Gaillard was trying to surrender. This kind of behavior by police officers has caused a lot of problems across the country. Mr. Dukes tried to explain his actions and change the facts, which makes his behavior even worse. What he did was completely unacceptable. We want to praise the Orangeburg Department of Public Safety for promptly firing Mr. Dukes and pursuing criminal charges against him. If there was a grade lower than an F, he definitely deserves it. Sergeant Polidor deserves an A+ for being honest and fair throughout the situation, making sure Mr. Julian had the necessary information to handle the incident, and maintaining a calm and professional attitude. While it can't be proven for sure, we believe Sergeant Polidor played a significant role in the department's decision to fire and charge Mr. Dukes. Her testimony in the incident report likely played a crucial part in ensuring he was held responsible for his actions. When police officers see other officers doing something wrong, they often have to decide if it's worth risking their own careers to report it. Many times, they try to defend their colleagues' actions in any way they can to avoid getting in trouble themselves. This happened recently when Sergeant Mayer praised Mr. Dukes for using appropriate force without knowing all the details. We want to applaud Sergeant Polidor for being brave enough to hold Mr. Dukes responsible for what he did. We hope her actions encourage other officers who see misconduct to speak up and do the right thing in their own police departments. Regarding Mr. Gaillard and Mr. Julian, we cannot give them a fair grade because their actions were solely influenced by how the officers behaved. They did nothing wrong, and they followed all the instructions given by the officers as best they could. Without knowing the full story, it could be argued that both Mr. Gaillard and Mr. Julian were victims of police misconduct. One experienced physical violence, while the other faced an attempt to avoid responsibility. It's important to mention that Mr. Julian genuinely tried to collect Officer Dukes' information, presumably to file a complaint against him. We commend him for recognizing that Officer Dukes' actions were unlawful and for taking steps to hold him accountable. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, we encourage you to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.